Bienvenidos a Antropoidezos. Soy Nicklas Quiros, filósofo y antropólogo, y creé este podcast para conversar y comprender a artistas, intelectuales y científicos del mundo. En este primer episodio tuve la oportunidad de hablar con Alois Kronschlaeger, un artista basado entre Nueva York y Ciudad de México. Su especialidad es el arte abstracto, y en este episodio hablamos sobre el futuro, la muerte, la vida y su proceso artístico. Vengan conmigo a descubrirlo.
Nicklas!
Alois, my friend, how's it going?
Happening? Great seeing you.
Yeah. Let's do it.
Let's do it. And this is like where I work on the series of the celluloseas, the aircrete blocks that are sort of like low density, high endurance bricks that are fabricated actually here in Mexico.
Are they concrete or?
It's concrete that has a lot of like air inside.
Yeah.
So it's a very, almost like a pumice stone.
Okay.
It's super light, and I devised stacking method that doesn't really exist within thinking about, bricks, Mesopotamia, 10,000 years ago. This is a stacking order that I have not really seen yet. It's sort of like a very atypical. You have all the weight is on the vertical bricks, and the horizontals are basically just distance holder that you can pull out, and the structure, the durability of this wall actually consists of the balance between the horizontal and the vertical brick.
Yeah. Looks like a Jenga a little bit, no?
A little bit of a Jenga. You have to be careful which one you pull out before this thing collapses. Perfect. Come on.
Amazing.
Let's head
go
into the actual studio.
Yeah. Let's get in.
So this is the first room where I have a lot of work, basically like on display.
Yeah.
Here, those are the torque pieces.
Yeah.
It deals with 100 rods, 4 different colors, how it's shifting at a 90-degree angle. This is aluminum hexagonal rods. Then those are the very early color fields. This one is from 2016. Some drawings, some silk screen prints. This is a grid structure, some yarn pieces, another hexagonal piece that's cast in polyester. So it's converging, like a rhomboid converges to a smaller rhomboid at a 90-degree angle. This was exhibited at Zona Marco with Kristen Tierney Gallery in New York. That's color field number 5. That sort of like showcases very much what's happening on the unprimed canvas when 2 colors meet. For example, a yellow and a blue intersect, turns green on that spot, but more later on.
Yeah.
That's a sculpture process consisting of 14 pancakes that turns into a rhomboid sculpture, something the exact shape like this. But this one is fading from black to white. Mm-hmm. And then I want to point something out here.
Yeah.
Let me sneak over here. This is a stainless steel cube that was produced for a show in Buenos Aires in 2018, where the screws are customized from a micro screw company in LA. They go to New York to the CNC router machine from a friend of mine who produces that. And what's happening basically is you have 6 colors. Each side has 1 color, and this color is printed on like a silk screen printing method, where before there is etching primer used. But this is like if you touch it for a second, stainless steel, super durable, because the other pieces are basically in wood.
It can just last forever, huh?
This will last
for a while. Not forever.
Maybe not for eternity, but for quite some time.
Yeah.
But that's like very much, when I say my work deals with time, space, and color, that's pretty much what I'm talking about.
What it means. How would you call this structure?
This is a grid structure. It's a rhomboid sculpture. Basically, it derives when you think about a cube in the diagonal axis, it creates visually a hexagon. And a hexagon consists of 3 rhomboids. So this is one rhomboid. And therefore, sort of like, if you let geometry unfold and let it sort of like, play out against the wall, a cube in a 3D perspective turns into a hexagon, and the hexagon consists of 3 rhomboids, and a rhomboid consists of 2 diagonals. So it becomes very much a play on geometry.
Yeah.
And shape. Okay. But let's go in here.
Amazing.
This is we call it the black room. The pieces that you saw before flat in front of color field number 5, this is when the large glacier, that's the title of this series, is basically glued together. It fades from black all the way to white. It has about 3,600 painted sides, because there are about 900 sticks. And so when depending how you install it, parallel to the floor or vertical, on the vertical axis, you have 12 different options how you can install this work.
So many ways in which you can think forms,
Yes. This is the polychromatic spinning cube, consisting of 48 different colors. What I did over here is, as we know from geometry, a cube has 6 sides. The earlier versions had 6 colors, 1 per side, but here I divided the cube into 8 smaller cubes, so 8 times 6 is 48. So you have 48 distinct colors that don't repeat, and we have 300 rods, so you have 1,200 sides that needed to be painted. And then, as you see upstairs later, I built a scale model, a very easy maquette out of cardboard, because I'm playing basically, chess with colors. So they have to match later on within the larger structure.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Then maybe if you look over here, when you see into the grid structures, how the various angles and colors merge and create certain density within the grid structure.
Yeah, mesmerizing, really.
Thank you.
And these are some other experiments.
Some other experiment, another torque. And also, there are a lot of drawings in here. So here, there's a lot of, work that's stored or waiting to be sent out for a show. This is maybe another interesting cube. I did a museum show in 2016 in Sharjah, where I was invited to this Islamic Arts Festival, basically where you have 2 cubes within a cube. It's an octagonal cube. So very much within thinking about Islamic art and the intricacy of geometry, pattern, math, and colors.
Yeah.
So but let's head upstairs.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the staircase leading up to where we work up here. There's a work hanging on this wall that I did during the pandemic in New York, where I used, again, yarn, colored yarn, but also I tinted the silicone to create this, almost like a blue cloud juxtaposing that very geometric, brutalist building facade. Mm-hmm. And here, this is a printout from a proposal where Brandon Hall, a British architect, a good friend of mine, invited me to submit a proposal for one of his buildings that he designed for Miami. It's 55 stories tall. So this is an artwork on a load-bearing wall that's 180 meter tall and 30 meter wide. Massive. And so what I did, and what I do a lot within site-specific work, I used one of his architectural lines, how his design of a terrace wraps around the building, comes around and then meets the floor. It was a concave land. So here I juxtapose convex and concave to create a pattern where I divided the wall into 400 squares. And then within, almost like seeing this, almost like this is the musical score sheet. And then I played my tune of musical notes to create a composition that is either on the vertical axis, horizontal axis, or diagonal axis, a pattern, a beat, a rhythmic intervention that doesn't repeat. So it's like they're all like a very unique musical score.
Yeah, what I find amazing is that I feel like the other works we've seen before are quite, like right angles. And like in here, you're actually playing a bit more with like perhaps an organic sort of notion of geometry. Right?
Yes. Yeah. And what we did with Pablo, our design architect who did those renders, where we printed out one of the nodes, they are called nodes, on a scale on 1:1, and we laid it out in front of the building on the street, and it was 18 yards in diameter. It's like on a massive scale.
Okay. Yeah.
Let's come in here. This is the room where
alchemy happens.
Yes, a lot of colors, a lot of pigments, a lot of testing. I do the paintings also over here. For example, like here, it's a color chart from a pigment company called Guerra Paint in New York that they use a lot. What do they have available?
Shout out to Guerra Paint. Yeah.
Yes, because I work with them closely. For example, here you have, various pigments.
Amazing.
And what's happening is I just saw them again in New York. And then since I'm making my own paints, you have the options, is it transparent? Is it opaque? What's the viscosity?
Yeah.
Is it metallic? Is it iridescent? So since I work with a lot of colors, you have, it's like you go down the rabbit hole, because suddenly you don't deal with, 10 colors, suddenly you deal with hundreds of colors, hundreds of different shades. Mm-hmm. Those are paints that I brought back now in New York. I have to unpack it. I arrived last night. The colors are organized by color families. But then if you think about colors or the negation of color, what happens if you work in class and everything that you see is because light and color gets refracted on the transparent surface. So for me, I love working with colors, but then also if you negate color, use a material that reflects all the colors and the ambient lighting.
Yeah, I think you said the basis for your work is really time, space, and
color. This is sort of like my chessboard to select the colors for a 48 color spinning cube. Those are basically my little maquettes, where I start out with a small sample and then break down the colors per plane. And then, for example, like here, it says, for example, front, left, back, right, up, and down, using letters that don't repeat. So when we start the staining process, we don't mix up the colors, because in the end, within the structure, it has to be totally cohesive and it has to match. It's almost like a puzzle.
Yeah.
But then also, for example, if I take this one just now, just to give you some life, we're going to step out into the hallway. This is wood, a wooden structure. It's super, super light. And as you can see, depending how you hang it, you have it either as a rhomboid, as almost like, as a diamond shape.
Yeah.
Or if you flip it, you can also have it sort of like as a horizontal diamond. So you have like 12 different ways how you can play with the sculptural shape of a rhomboid within sort of like the architectural setting. For example, this one over there is on a diamond shape because it plays with the vertical axis of the staircase.
Yeah, it's really...
Okay, let me just put this one back for a second.
No problem.
This goes right in here. Yes. Here's Florencia, Miniti, mi esposa hermosa preciosa. Actually, her working space that at times I infringe upon, that are some of her creations within sort of like thinking about fashion and design. At times we collaborate, for example, like the ink pouring and stuff like this. That's what I did within her body of work. Just like one detail over here, those are like the hexagonal rods that getting prepared where the color needs to be applied on 6 sides. The rod is divided into 3 different units. The bottom base is longer because like 2 inches are hidden within the base. Those are some detailed drawings within sort of like the project proposal for Miami. But maybe let's walk out here. Just maybe another thing, this is a work that I did in 2010 in New York. Those are photograms where I also worked a lot with aluminum mesh. That's also great, but way more pliable. And I created a series of structural shapes where then I did a direct exposure. So again, thinking about light, creating a photographic image without a camera. Shall we head out or? Yeah.
Nice to see you. In addition of being a great friend and a thinker, you're also a great artist. You grew up in Austria. Later you moved to New York. You've been recognized as a kinetic artist in Latin America. Also as an architectural artist in the US. And even somehow an Islamic artist because of your structures and your mathematical geometric forms. How are you?
I'm very good, Nicklas. Thanks for having me. Thanks for doing this podcast.
Yeah, amazing.
Here in the patio trasero, in the backyard of our studio here.
Yeah.
I'm doing good.
Yeah.
We got back to Mexico City last night. My wife Florence and I, we arrived late, so we were quite surprised what you had in store for us today, right?
I'm glad you were able to, to be present and just be yourself, You say you're good, but I see some, like purple in your arm and like what's going on there? What happened?
Well, what happened is we were in New York and then unfortunately I had to go to Austria for a funeral. My sister-in-law passed away of cancer.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Thank you. And on the day before the funeral, my brother asked me if I want to go on a bicycle ride, if I want to take his e-bike. And not having been back in Austria for a while, I obviously wanted to explore like old paths from my childhood. And I took his bicycle and I drove down to this river valley that leads into the Danube Valley. And unfortunately, I crashed.
Is it a mountainous region or is it more
it's like the rolling hills?
Okay.
It's not the Alps. It's think about like the rolling hills and a lot of forests and a lot of rivers. It's sort of like right between, if you think about Vienna and Munich, on the Danube, there's where the Danube makes this S-curve, and it's a very beautiful sort of like region, and a lot of people bicycle, and I took his bicycle and I went down this very steep hill.
Yeah.
I crashed, took a 360, and landed on a rock.
Yeah.
So I broke my collarbone.
Extreme sports, basically, that you were doing, no? Tony Hawk, basically,
Yes, I didn't want to do a stunt, but somehow I think I overestimated the complexity of that downward path.
Yeah, I see. And but you can, you move normal, or you have
I can do this, but not. I shouldn't do this.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I usually have it in a sling, but right now, during this interview, I'm just resting it on the armchair, so I will be fine.
Okay. So after hearing, that you're a kinetic artist, maybe you're a architectural artist, or Islamic artist? Like, what do you actually consider yourself? Do you?
I mean, for me, it's a good question, but for me, primarily, I'm an artist. And then people say, "Oh, what do you do? Is it painting? Is it sculpture?" And then I say, "Well, it's sort of like a mix between sort of like doing site-specific work."
Yeah. So with site, just for the listeners, like what do you mean with site-specific? I know it seems very evident.
Yes. But site-specific sort of like implies when you create a work specifically for one place that couldn't exist in another place without having those contingent factors.
Such as?
Architecture, could be urban footprint, it could be geology, it could be responding to a certain historical context.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like very, very broad. So when people ask me what I do, I say, I'm an artist, but I would sort of like say, for example, like, Walter Gropius had a great way of talking about sort of like the Bauhaus.
Yeah.
And when he talks about art, architecture, design, and fashion, and I sort of like work within this bandwidth.
Okay.
So it's like, it's like a very loose understanding of working in numerous fields, but I would not call myself a kinetic artist.
Yeah.
Even though some people reference work of mine that are kinetic works, and then they say, well, you belong to this category. But for me, yes, it's sort of like it's a very specific word, but it might be too limiting.
But I guess it's fascinating to see how people actually project like their ideas of art to your work, right? Like, because in the end, you're sort of a mirror when you're creating this work. Of course, it's for you. It means something as an artist, and then you create it, and there's like a context that people interpret, and it might be something completely off to what you actually thought, no? So there's like some crystal vision there, no? Like they have a bias and they project.
Yes, but also like, when it always depends, when do the people see the work? Do they see the work already in the studio, or do they see it in a gallery setting or in a museum setting, or within an architectural site-specific, context? So
why do you think that matters? Like, what's the? I mean, of course, the ambience and the environment sort of create that experience as well. But like, do you think?
I mean, if somebody has the chance to see the work already in the studio, one might be a little bit more pre-informed about the process, or like about the artist per se, and then it can change the visual appearance when it leaves sort of like the studio. There's always this moment where when suddenly something was very private hits the public realm and the open interaction with the public per se.
So I mean, it's a fascinating aspect to think of, because always this private-public distinction is like so weird in our lives, no? Because we also behave completely different when we are like, I have to just walk in a certain way because everyone, like in New York, where you have your place, it's like everyone has to go into this stream of fast and furious, but in your private life you might be hating that. You sort of have to act out something in the public and something in the private, no? You're so more authentic, of course. In
yes,
the
but
private.
also like even like, for example, how even already Plato talked about the artist in the role as an artist and the artist as a private person. So I think there's also like...
Can you give us a bit of an insight into that?
In a sense, I think that, if you come to the studio and I give you a little tour of, what we did just before, it's sort of like a very informal thing, that it's sort of like, it's me, the private person, showing you the work in process. But then if I have to, for example, like, give a talk at a gallery opening or within a museum, then you definitely have the role of the artist presenting your work.
Yeah.
So I think there are certain nuances how the public either wants to engage just with the work, and there's sometimes great example where maybe the less you know about the artist, maybe the easier is to view the work within your own reflection. And then if you know more about the artist and more about the work, then it could also force a certain sense of like, oh yeah, but he did this or he said that.
Right. Like your subjectivity is sort of in place.
Yes.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, I guess I wanted to ask, first of all, that I see mainly you're doing abstract art, and somehow I want to go a bit into this aspect, like what is it about the abstract that for you has this punch, that it captivates you? I mean, clearly you're, I don't want to use the word obsessed, but you're really into it.
Well, I mean, for example,
how come?
I would always, for example, a reference of a work that I did in 2001 in Austria and in the Czech Republic was called 15-degree longitude east. And the idea was, I was invited for a competition, and I was researching where is it in Austria, and then it's like west of Vienna, in this region called Waldviertel, like a little bit northwest of Vienna. And then I realized that the Middle European time zone goes exactly in that region, so it's 15-degree longitude east. And then having read a science novel years before called, Longitude by Dana Saval, I had suddenly the impetus to produce, or at least to attempt to illustrate a scientific principle through architectural interventions, where a person in the Czech Republic and in Austria could have the same experience. Was it abstract? Yes, but science can be sort of like an abstract way of thinking, but then it actually becomes very easy to execute a scientific principle and see it sort of like almost like a theater play where you use materials like a stage set, and then you let nature do the rest.
Yeah, and in a way you can apply these sort of abstract notions to reality, right?
Yes.
And come up with new discoveries, of course. And,
yes.
That's fascinating. So, I mean, getting this notion of like the abstract, what do you think like an audience should understand when they are seeing abstract art? Because I'm sure there's like people thinking, well, come on, I like figurative art and I like the symbols and the hyper like iconography and sometimes they are like, well, I mean, I could do this color there and I mean, of course, I think that's a bit, they think too much of themselves sometimes, but
I mean, when I do my processes in the studio, I don't have the public in mind.
Yeah.
And people say, but how can it be? But no, I say, when the work leaves the studio and it goes to the gallery, how people could or should view the work, I don't give them any instructions.
Yeah.
The only instruction that I would say in general is, and I think as an artist, or at least myself, I'm a very curious person. So if the viewer is confronted with an abstract work, call it an installation or like a painting or whatever it is, or a site-specific installation, I would always, advise just, be curious. Mm-hmm. See yourself in that space and look for different vantage points to try to figure out how the space was mapped out. Mm. And by changing the position in the room, you might also view the work differently. And since my work deals a lot with 3D or kinetic aspects, there's always sort of like a certain sense where the viewer becomes the protagonist to explore the space, or the viewer activates the work per se.
Right. Even if the work doesn't seem to move, they have to go around and check every little, thing. There's a philosophy step that usually is called, by some random philosopher called Edmund Husserl,
Okay.
who, he was in Germany, I think, at the time, back in the 30s and 20s and so on. But he thought of this term called epoche. And
yes.
That's a better way to say it, probably. And it literally means to sort of bracket the world and like place your biases like in a bucket, somewhere else, and just like perceive how things are, and the fact that you can see objects in a different way. So if you see this microphone, you might need to go around it and check it out and see what's actually its dimension, and perhaps it's not real as in we can perceive like atoms,
right,
but it's an object that takes a form thanks to our perception, right? So
yes.
I think it's similar to what the audience has to do in a gallery when they see a work, right? As you're saying.
And I think this is always like very interesting how sort of like people in private spaces or in public spaces are animated to interact with the public realm.
Right.
And a gallery has a certain curatorial visual, check markers where you create. This is like architecture. Like you think about why certain what leads up to a building. What leads up to a certain view? The viewfinder in a camera, So, and this is like always exciting. How I think as an artist and as well as a viewer, how you are looking for your reflection within that space, and how you can get a sense of exploration. I'm just thinking about like how crazy it is that most of the places where we move are already pre-designed, and so our knowledge of like what nature is somehow comes into this like weird ambivalent like term that actually sometimes we think, it's natural to be in the city. No, there's nothing there that actually is regarded as something that comes completely from like natural selection or that, as you're saying, like most places and architectures already have these like pre-perception sort of thought out. Yes.
And
I had, for example, I think about stuff like Mexico City, the Humix Museum from David Chipperfield is a fantastic building, a fantastic museum. And just a quick anecdote, David Chipperfield designed the Figge Museum in Davenport, Iowa. Okay. It was his first public commission. And my last museum show in 2018 was in that museum. So the museum invited me for, let's say like 5 days to explore the museum and then try to figure out how I could respond within a site-specific installation, but keeping the architecture in mind. And
how did you do that? Like, what happened?
It's a long story, but
give us the journey.
Yes, but I basically proposed 4 different projects. But for me, I had this moment where the museum is right on the Mississippi River, and the architecture is sort of like very vernacular. Sort of like it has a vertical tower like a grain silo, and meeting a horizontal plane that sort of like looks very much like a barn shed. So he was fusing the grain silo vertical axis with this horizontal plane of the shed. And it has very beautiful rooms. But then you enter the museum, you go up the stairs, and then on the west side of the museum, you have this massive view of the Mississippi River, but there's this massive staircase. And I went, throughout the museum for several days, and nobody was ever there in the in that massive staircase, and started to question myself, why was nobody being there, or like, but it was sort of like this staircase, and I thought, oh, the staircase is not, ADA accessible. It limits interaction. It's like you have a view, but then how could you, suddenly bring all those people that enter the museum to enjoy the view of the museum, outlooking to the Mississippi River? I proposed complicated ramps that the museum didn't agree on. But as an artist doing site-specific work, in the end, you're looking for those moments where you feel like, oh, how come this space doesn't work? Or it doesn't work because there's no interaction of people, or like people are not going into that space. So you sort of like question yourself, what could be done to amplify a space, to activate something. And I think a lot of time the viewers, you can excite them to explore a path that they never took before.
Pretty crazy.
And that's stuff like where I'm talking about, time and space and doing site-specific work. That's sort of like what comes into consideration.
Makes sense. So we hear a bit of a like water pump going on right now on the back. We hear some cars in the background. Of course, this is Mexico City, so it's like a hyped up city. It's always alive. It's always sort of up and running. And I want to know like what Mexico City and Mexico in general sort of mean to you, and like just give me your impressions and how do you get here?
Right. I mean, like. I absolutely love Mexico and Mexico City, and the first time I came to Mexico was 10 years ago. Actually now 11 years ago. It was 2013.
Time passes by quickly.
Time passes by so quickly. And I did a 2-person show with Aldo Chaparro, who is Peruvian Mexican artist, a dear friend of mine.
Great artist,
And we did a show together in his studio, and that sort of like created an avalanche of connections. And also, I must say that we are here in this studio thanks to my dear friends from Del Parque, the Tres Enriques, who are dear friends and also patrons of mine, but more importantly, dear friends that we used to come.
Shout out to them, by the way.
Yes, we would come like 2, 3, 4 times a year, finish a project, and then I talked to Enrique Tez and to Enrique Marcatella, and I said, we would love to have a studio here because Mexico is so vibrant. And then in 2019. They informed us that they have this building that maybe we could consider using, and here we are.
Here we are. This is the studio.
This is a studio, thanks to them. So
big shout out then.
Big shout. And for me, Mexico is sort of like so interesting because me coming from Austria and having lived in New York since 1986 and spent some time in Tokyo in the early 90s. Having traveled a lot, I always was looking for like a place where I would say that would be a city I could imagine leaving New York. And I can say that Mexico City is the city that I can imagine leaving New York for a while. And so we have stuff like this.
The current situation.
The current situation that's like occupying, 2 cities and 2 studios, and it's fantastic.
And has it, work before arriving, the type of works, architectural works that you were sort of creating, which were always like mesmerizing, of course, because you always use like geometry. But when we talked previously, you mentioned to me Mexico brought something very specific to my life.
And what happened is like monochromatic.
Right.
I never really used colors. I might have used at times like, an orange that was juxtaposed with a wooden structure and like, silicone. My wife came to Mexico City. I was absolutely astonished what color can do, thinking about emotional architecture, Luis Barragan, Matthias Goeritz, the foliage, Rosa Americana, all the colors that I was confronted with. And that gave me sort of like the idea of using color, and that's where the polychromatic spinning cube was born out of that experience. So for me, it was like, in a sense, I had to rewrite my hard drive of like, who I am as an artist. And the work I did in New York, you cannot just replicate what you did in New York in Mexico. In Mexico, you do different kind of works. And
it hits differently.
And therefore you have to, the environment, the ambience affects you. And so color got the best of me.
Well, I mean, Mexico does, and there's so many artists that have been sort of influenced by, sort of specifically Mexico City, but also in general, I can think of Jack Kerouac, like from the Beat Generation, who was like this great writer and writes on the road and, ends up in Mexico City a bit sick from my understanding of the book. But, there's just so many poets, painters, Carrington, Remedios Varo, think of Pedro Friedeberg, that have been sort of in love with the color here and sort of have added an abstract dimension to it at times, in the case of Friedeberg, or a more surrealist experience. I think André Breton said like Mexico is the most surreal place on earth, and it somehow makes sense to me. I've been out of Mexico a while and came back, and I am like, it's insane what the city is like and what can happen and the culture that sort of makes you feel, involved in.
And Mexico City, think about all the museums, the architecture, the galleries, the artist community. It's just such a vibrant thing that is absolutely on the international, frontiers. What's happening in the art world.
I think also of like another artist like Wolfgang Palen, who was also a surrealist. They all were, they got really into it. So of course Kahlo and Rivera and all the big muralists. Francis Alice, Belgian guy coming. A big shout out to Belgium. They just are amazed by this place, and I'm fascinated by that connection with art and culture. And
and also like for us, it's since my wife is from Buenos Aires, Argentina. And me being from Austria, but like Mexico City is like so central for the Americas. And the connection to Europe. So it's it's such a close interval in the proximities.
Do you agree? Okay, I have this notion that people always say Buenos Aires is like the Paris of Latin America, and I feel maybe people will judge me for this, but I have a feeling that Mexico City is somehow the New York of Latin America.
I would, on the first, Buenos Aires is definitely sort of like the Paris of South America, and what...
With a bit of Italy, right?
Yes.
Like Napoli combined with Paris or so.
I could imagine that New York City in the late 50s, early 60s was maybe what Mexico City is now, where you had a lot of sort of like, movements where maybe, a certain energy shifted from New York to Mexico now. So like almost like, where the magnetic needle is suddenly shifting and it's being calibrated again. So
Alois is always using scientific metaphors, so this is very important, okay? So we hear that you come from, well, at the moment you're coming from New York, right. And you have quite a long stay there, and you studied in New York, yeah. Right? So where did you study in New York?
I did my master's of fine arts at the School of Visual Arts.
Okay.
I finished in 2002.
Yeah.
And just
a while ago, huh?
A while ago, yes, 22 years ago. And before that, I did my undergraduate at Empire State College in New York.
Okay.
So, yes, New York has been sort of like my place of reference where I became an artist.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sure you had some really incredible teachers. I would love you to give some shout out to some really important people that have influenced you and also sort of made you question maybe the world and you know, like what influences have you had?
I mean, for example, you know, the School of Visual Arts is a very interesting place where, first of all, you don't have tenured professors.
Okay.
It's only artists who are actually practicing and who are active in the art world.
Yeah, so only if you're legit, you can actually do it. You know, no academics here, just
I mean, there are a lot of
the serious thing.
You know, legit professors, despite their career, not their career.
Yeah, I apologize to the academics, you know.
But for example, like, you know, Jerry Saltz, the art critic for the New Yorker, who won the Pulitzer Prize a couple of years ago.
Wow.
He was one of my professors. Or if you think about Sarah C., the amazing installation artist, he's also, you know, was teaching there.
But like, why were these sort of characters influencing you? Like what?
Because I think.
What had they?
I mean, what I would say within the influences is, back then when I did my MFA, I still used the human figure within an architectural setting that was seen more like an architectural annex. Right. My thesis project, for example, was a film that I did on 16mm called Again Somehow, where I used essay by Virginia Woolf.
Yeah, great writer.
Narrative for my visual composition, where numerous characters were seen behind sort of like this transparent silicon wallpaper with a fleur-de-lis pattern and using colors. So it dealt with space that was imagined. What I would say, as a young artist, you have, you know, multiple professors that you audit their classes and you admire them and
you want their content. You want to feel the essence, you know, what's going on.
What's happening.
Yeah.
But since I finished, you know, 22 years ago my MFA, and I taught at the School of Visual Arts for many years. I gave studio critiques during the summer residency program. So I'm very aware and well in tune with the institution. But then what happens in New York is when you study there, you're sort of like inside a bubble.
Right.
As a student, in tune with your professors and stuff like. But as soon as you sort of like burst that bubble and you get confronted by reality in New York, then you suddenly grow as an artist, because sort of like you're not anymore in a sheltered environment.
Right. That always happens, right? Like when you leave the student life, which is really like living in a cult for some 6 years, 3 years, 4 years, I don't know, and then suddenly going back. Well, not back. I mean, going to the world, the working world, and figuring it out. It's a tough experience, man. It's
very tough. And so, like the longitude project that I mentioned before, I did in 2001, independent of my studies, because I already applied for this project before I even did my MFA. And so, there was always this moment that, you sort of like in a rush trying to manage time.
Yeah.
And to elaborate even further on that sense, like in a sense, what I think I got out of graduate school, my MFA, yes, you learn about art history, art theory, all wonderful, important thing. But I think doing this in New York, what I got out of it, how can you manage your time and stay physically and mentally in shape, that you actually maintain your a certain healthy.
And I'm just gonna say, as an artist, that is quite tough, isn't it?
It's always very, very
because I mean, it's a world of a lot of pleasure.
Yes.
And I feel you have to go crazy to be successful as well, right? Like,
yeah, and then there's also this moments where, like, you have to survive. Like, New York is very expensive. Like,
expensive.
You have to be, economically afloat.
Yeah.
And then you have to have your moments of, where you're only confronted by yourself, you in your studio. So I after coming out of graduate school, I divided my day into 3 7-hour units.
Okay.
Mentally.
Again, Alois loves scientific references, so even his own time he's thinking this way,
Yes, and so where I said, okay, 7 hours of sleep for your physical, mental health, 7 hours of making money. That means for me teaching at a university or doing freelance work or the gallery selling work. And then 7 hours of working in a studio to maintain my artistic integrity.
Yeah.
Why I'm in New York, why I want to be there.
Yeah.
Makes 21, and then to make 24. So the 3 hours is the travel distance between the 3 locations. If you put everything on the same priority list, you cannot really undermine your artistic objective, because it's about sort of like multitasking. It's like, you want to be there because you want to do work, and having been in New York now since like 38 years off and on, you see a lot of events that can shape you in a tragic way, or like in a very sort of like traumatic way. And
you mean here 9/11 or something like that, or what's going on?
Suicides from friends, or drugs, or people just disappearing because they go back to wherever they things. So New York
is a transit city, right?
It's a transit city. So in New York, you are confronted, and as an artist, you're always confronted with yourself in the studio of who you are and what are you doing now. So to bring it back to your question of education, the School of Visual Arts was fantastic within the MFA program to nurture that time with yourself in the studios of that you're in tune with yourself. And I think this is like the most important thing that I got out of that educational background.
So learning to be alone, basically, and like doing the work that you need to do, and
learning to
cherishing it.
Yes,
somehow.
Learning to be by yourself and stuff, like trying to find a voice within yourself.
And that's super tough. I mean, when I think of like times when we feel like bored, really, and you cannot get your mind into it, and you're like, fuck, like maybe I can watch, I don't know, some other ridiculous stuff in Instagram or like TikTok and laugh about it. I mean, today it's worse, I guess, from before, because it's just our mind is just constantly searching for an escape route.
Right. No? And I'm sure that the MFA program is being taught totally different now with social media.
I'm sure,
it's been a while. In the early 2000s, where I could only make a reference back then, sort of like to have a blog account was sort of like the Instagram back then, where you talked about your processes. But then it all shifted. But in a sense, like New York is, you are constantly in a state of being in flux.
But wait, so tell me a bit more of like the influences from your teachers. Like who can you give me another name and like what you were like, oh, he was good at really like painting this, or you know, or
no,
like
I wouldn't go like this. For example, you know, one thesis advisor that I absolutely enjoyed is Belgium too, Johan Grimmenbretz.
Grimmenbretz.
Yes, he did a movie called Dial History.
Okay.
And he did it in 1997, if I'm correct. And it tells the complex double narrative between airline hijackings and the socio-political commentary that happened in the time frame of the 60s and the 70s, and through the fashion of the stewardesses.
Okay.
And it's this amazing
crazy mix.
It has shown all around the world. And on the day, since you mentioned 9/11, and I'm still getting goosebumps thinking about 9/11 in this moment. 9/11, back then with now my ex-girlfriend, a classmate of mine, we left our place in Williamsburg. We get out of the subway to have a lecture by Johan Grimmenbretz.
Grimmenbretz. I just love the last name.
And then, you know, we look up and we say, oh, what are all these people looking, you know, south? Then we look down and we say, oh, you know, World Trade Center is on fire.
Exploded, yeah.
So like,
we went apart.
Like, think about stuff like...
We're not going to get into the conspiracies, guys. So.
Getting into this, but think about stuff like an influence within... Having been a student in New York between 2000 and 2002, and my advisor was Johan Grimmenbretz, and 9/11 happened, and he did a film, 4 years prior to that.
Felt prophetic? You feel like it had some weird thing going on, or
it happened where sort of like the narrative of being at the right place at the right time, as the Americans say, can suddenly create a moment of like that affects you.
Yeah.
And it might stick around for you for a while.
Yeah.
So I would say he was definitely a big influence within telling a story.
Yeah.
Thinking about stuff like, you know, the complexities.
So the narrative and how to bring that into the visuals as well, I imagine, right?
Yes.
Let me ask you a bit about other influences. So, I mean, I get that New York has been a big part of you, but so what other artists have marked your path, you know, like that you've said, wow, like the first time I saw this, it just changed me and I just thought, well, I should be an artist, or, you know, perhaps you were like, oh, now I want to do abstract art because this guy just made this incredible, you know, pattern and it just made my brain collapse or something, you know?
I mean, I don't want to sort of like, you know, I'm not trying to evade your question.
Yeah, okay.
But
a little bit. I have a feeling here you're going to go there.
But what I'm saying in a sense, like, it's always sort of like, you know, a certain sense of a situational context.
Sure.
I never, you know, romanticized of becoming an artist. I left Austria not knowing what I really want to do. I imagined maybe I want to be something that deals with theater, or like stage set design, or maybe architecture or something like this. So I went sort of like on this vision quest to explore who I was and what I wanted to do. And for example, like one anecdote just to mention, when I was living in Tokyo, I worked with Franco Zeffirelli, Theatre La Scala from Milano, as an extra during 3 productions of Nabucco, Turandot, and La Bohème. And that massive sort of like, again, how a scene can suddenly change really rapidly between acts.
Yeah.
The people backstage, what's happening here, for example, right now.
Yeah.
And so I always loved space, as my wife told you earlier, my line is, I always loved space. And so there are certain moments where that comes again a metaphor. For example, there are a lot of architects that I think that are absolutely think about dado.
Yeah, dado, yeah.
Or think about Louis Barragan.
Yeah.
Or even like when you visit their house and the shutters that are divided into 4 leaflets.
Yeah.
And you can close it and open it depending how you want it. And supposedly, what I heard is Dado Ando has been there many times, and playing with when the shutters are almost closed, but you have a tiny sliver of light on a vertical axis and a horizontal axis, was maybe a certain reference that he later did in his famous building in Japan of the things. So,
So you think Barragan really had an effect on Tadao Ando? I mean, that's
absolutely.
That's of
but
course.
Then if you, so it's always in a sense like I like the work from Isamu Noguchi.
Okay.
Thinking about Akari, about light, and the stone sculptures.
So like these Dansekwa sort of minimalists from Japan, Korea, China.
Yeah, but then if you realize that Noguchi was an assistant to Brancusi, it becomes interesting when you have like 3 generational or 2 generational gap, how you realize how one influenced the other. Yeah. And so like, I think as an artist, you have certain, figures that you admire.
Yeah.
But then you have to, chisel and undermine their validity and claim your own thing. So there's a certain self-destroyer modus built in of being an artist and having your mentors.
Yeah, it's interesting that art has to move through these like process of like self-destruction all the time and sort of like turning to ash to then like be reborn, maybe a bit like.
Yes.
I mean, it sounds romanticized, but like a phoenix. But
yes,
I think okay.
For example, if you think about the American painter John Curran, he recontextualizes Hieronymus Bosch, and so thinking about what is the even the gapification of the American fashion clothes and how he dresses his character. Then going back to Hieronymus Bosch.
Yeah.
So I think that for me, influences are, Joseph Albers, obviously thinking about colors. No doubt you think about...
Let's jump there, because I know, let me give some context, because I feel like tons of your work, your works in plural, have like squares really into the structure, either them being like cubes, or just different diamond shapes, or you are an expert in using somehow his idea, his homage to the square, his love for it. And what I understand from Albers, and maybe it's a good moment to talk about it,
right,
is that when I see your work and I see the way that you sort of have to destroy your old system to create something new, you can make a homage to Albers, but Albers really thought like the geometric structures are quite stable and quite like somehow static. I mean, the square is not moving. It should be always in the same shape, and it should be within. And you don't do that. I mean, since the spinning cube, I think you challenged that idea of like the square being stable and it being actually quite dynamic and sort of like moving. And of course, Mexico had an impact in you, and maybe Albers didn't have that luck, to have those colors affect the perception, and
Yes, but so like what I would say, talking about the square, but before the square existed for me in my body of work, my work dealt with lines.
Right.
For example, like I will answer your question, but just to elaborate a little bit. In 1997, I participated in an artist residency program with Francisco Castro Lenero, the Mexican painter who just died 2 years ago. He was the first Mexican artist I met in Austria during a 1-month-long residency.
Okay.
And I'm just bringing it up because I think at times also about his work, but going back to the lines, I was redrawing the line of an object that casted a shadow on the day of the fall equinox, and it was a perfectly straight line. Every other day throughout the year it would be hyperbola. Within the longitude project, I tried to visualize this imaginary line called longitude. Within the repercussion series, I used Frank Stella.
Right.
I love absolutely his work, his early work, the Coney Island series, that dealt stuff like with pinstripe things, and I created lines on Italian Fabriano paper that I would compress later and turn curvilinear. So like where it becomes volumetric. The square for me happened with an installation, the first exhibition with Christian Tierney, where I used the 3D axis to map out the space to create this massive installation that was suspended from the ceiling. And using, X, Y, and Z, the cube derived as one cell. And then later on, with Mexico, the color was added within the cube. And Albers, he has sort of like this quote that you referenced before. For him, a square was always on a horizontal plane, never on a diagonal axis. What I did with my sort of like coming back from Mexico City to New York, I remember Enrique Macutela from Del Parque, Marco as we call him, and his wife Riza came to our studio in Greenpoint in New York, and Florence and I, we were there, and I just finished constructing a cube that was still resting on the horizontal plane, meaning the floor, on the desk. But it already had the 6 colors, and I said to Marco, check, if you flip it on a diagonal axis and you spin it, you see the shifting plane from the geometry turning from 3D to 2D, flattening, and the eye is trying to catch up with the shifting color plane. So like you always feel like you are a step behind. And that was sort of like the moment where I realized that I touched upon something new that was for me not existing prior in my body of work, where suddenly numerous factors came together.
I guess.
And when you do this, then suddenly you look for references. What is the historical trajectory? Who worked with those colors?
Did I have an original idea, or am I using actually like
or do I
the
knock
context?
Somebody off, and I'm like not informed that somebody else did this one years prior. So suddenly you can have these moments where you feel like, oh my God, is this absolute ingenious or is it absolute bullshit because somebody else did this? So there's sort of like this moment where you do your research and then find out that yes, Albers is absolutely a fantastic reference for the work. He also spent a lot of time in Mexico, and he has a great theory about colors. But then you acknowledge those references, you articulate them, and
demolish,
and then you move on into your own path, basically.
I mean, you have to. You did somehow reshape the notion of a square for me. I mean, from what I've seen from your work and your site-specific installations and sculptures and now paintings that you're doing, which we still have to get into. But
yes. For example, I would love what Albers would think about the paintings. But I just think, as a sort of like anecdotal question that you would ask sometimes.
I mean, this notion of the line where you started actually I mean, it's a notion of topography, isn't it? It's like, it's actually talking about the way that we have mapped the planet or the universe and the tools that we need. I mean, again, we go back to abstraction because you love these notions that somehow help you, like a formula that is really synthetic, simple, and it just brings you to a massive understanding of like the rest of things, right?
And that's where it brings me to the Greek mathematician Ptolemy. You pronounce him slightly differently.
Yeah, Ptolemy. We're talking about, or Ptolomeo in Spanish for those that want to understand the context.
And he already had the idea of like longitude and latitude, and thinking about mapping, or like how you read a map, or how you read, horizontal and vertical lines. And
wait, but tell us a bit more of these like scientific theories that have sort of shaped your imagination and triggered you. You mentioned Ptolemy, if we want to pronounce it your way, but tell me about what he did. Like, I want to understand the facts.
Like, to map out space, he used horizontal and vertical lines to give the idea of time.
Right.
So he merged time and space within a 2D diagram, like on a schema. And I like the complexities because the scale of it becomes then a question. Like, what is this? What is the scale? Is this map in scale 1 to 1,000,000 or 1 to 12? And then it becomes infinitive, thinking about the expansion of the universe, of like, how does that square...
How do you map it?
How do you map it? And how do you create this illusion of time and space?
Yeah. It's fascinating. Did he come up with this before the Egyptians? Do we actually know for a fact that thing, or we are unsure? Maybe it's possible that the Egyptians had influenced him.
Ask ChatGPT.
Yeah, ChatGPT. Guys, we need to find
what's happening.
This question on ChatGPT.
I can tell you one thing. Within our current longitude and latitude lines on this planet Earth, as we call Earth, they were redrawn by John Harrison, who was an English clockmaker in the 17th century.
Very late after...
Very, very late, because back then the zero meridian used to go through Paris.
Right.
And upon John Harrison solved the problem of navigation by inventing the chronometer, the zero meridian was shifted to Greenwich, and that drew everything around in new increments.
Don Alonso, we're gonna take a short break. What do you like to drink?
A matcha would be great.
Vamos a tomar una pequeña pausa. Si quieres apoyar a Anthropoides 2, puedes encontrar nuestras redes sociales en la descripción. Recuerda suscribirte y no olvides compartir este episodio.
Gracias.
Salud.
Salud.
Alois, did you ever want to be something different than an artist?
Well, for a long time, I really didn't know what I wanted to do, but I always had this imagination as a thing that maybe an astronaut would be a perfect counterpart to being an artist.
Okay, I know where we're going with this. I know
Exploring
you're gonna...
about time and space, but within a very different proportion of scale.
Yeah. I have a feeling you want to include a story when you first arrived to New York. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Or
Yes. If you think about, for example, like the World's Fair in New York, 1964, you had stuff like the jetpack man, like, you would press two buttons and like take off. So when I left Austria in 1986, I wanted to hitchhike, but I didn't want to look like, a hippie.
right.
So I didn't use the other word before hippie. So I didn't want to look like a hippie. So I had this idea of like dressing up, sort of like, how an astronaut would travel space, having a large aluminum suitcase on my back and a small side attaché suitcase on my side that would turn into a coffee table. And so when I was standing on the road, people wondered, what does this guy have in his suitcase?
What the hell is going on with this guy?
Where does he come from?
Yeah.
So
why is he shining in the dark?
Yeah, I was hitchhiking from Austria to Belgium again, to Brussels.
Amazing.
And then, landed in New York on a one-way flight with People Express. And then I went up to Buffalo, but then I was hitchhiking through, Toronto, Montreal, Quebec, and then back to New York City. But the idea of traveling and how you sort of like position yourself as a hitchhiker within the landscape so that people can actually see you on time before they decide to, they can check you out, they can decide, okay, no, I'm not picking up this guy, he looks too strange. Or they can slow down and then stand there, pull over and then you put the suitcase in the back and then you take off. So being an astronaut, I think, would be still sort of like an idea that I would like to, keep vivid in my mind.
Okay, so let me ask you this: if Elon Musk suddenly says, "Okay, we need some crowd going to Mars," it's gonna be a bit of a shitty life, let's accept, but you can be an astronaut in that mission. Would you take that?
I mean, obviously, I have to talk to my wife, Florence.
Yeah, Flora,
first. I mean,
she has to.
We always travel together, so I guess it's going to be an astronaut couple, maybe.
Okay.
Exploring the space.
You can save that one that way, yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Well, and you left Austria quite some time ago, and you just came back actually from a short trip. But what do you carry from Austria with you? What is still Austrian in you? I mean, I understand identity-wise, you might feel, of course, language identified ethnically or whatever, but what is actually an aspect you think, well, actually, the moment that I am so precise, or the moment I bring up, or I have a weird craving that day, and it's this Austrian thing, so what is this?
I mean, it's a very good question. I had a very funny encounter many years ago. I worked in an antique shop selling furniture. I think it was my first job in New York. And this guy comes in and inquires about a painting. And I told him, oh yeah, this painting is from, Stift Melk. It's west of Vienna on the Danube. And he said, how come you know about this painting? And I said, well, I'm Austrian. And he looked at me very strangely and he said, well, if you're Austrian, then you're like a tree without roots. And back then I was very shocked. It was, I just left Austria. So when I think back about Austria, obviously there are a lot of memories that you have growing up, in that sense.
Yeah.
The landscape, having spent a lot of time observing the light within, sort of I come from the countryside. And now I was just back, and sort of I've been away now from Austria since 38 years, 2/3 of my life I lived abroad. You never forget where your roots are, but somehow there's a certain disconnect. It's not a disconnect just with, maybe your siblings or, your friends from back then, but there's a sense of that, you cannot go back to a place that maybe you once loved, as I think Florencia, my wife, says quite a bit, a quote you cannot step in the same river twice.
Yeah.
So there's something that is obviously gone and has been missing, but in a sense it has been a way of becoming who one is now. So it's always about the now.
Yeah.
So I'm not a nostalgic person where I'm but you know your upbringing, you know your roots, you value certain things. Yes, did I follow the Austrian, matches within the European Cup? Yes. Did I vote for them? Of course, but it's not like a sense where I say, "Oh, I'm so Austrian." But
you don't have this like, I'm gonna use this word like intense, extreme nostalgia for a country that was once something, and this conservative sort of mindset.
I mean, there's an Austrian philosopher, Erwin Ringel, who wrote a book, Die österreichische Seele, the Austrian soul, and he talked about sort of like a very Austrian thing that, Austria is very complex historically, what's going on politically, and he had sort of like this idea that as an Austrian, it's important to leave Austria because you don't want to be stuck in Austria.
Right.
And then once you made it, maybe you want to consider to go back there, and everyone tells you, "Oh, we knew it's like so fantastic." So I've no feeling of going back to Austria, but there's a certain sense of maybe the Austrian identity, as he described in this book, that maybe rings true to having that certain input growing up in Austria.
I mean, and you do speak of like landscape again, so yes. I mean, this marks, of course, like a trajectory that you've been working on, and perhaps unconsciously from your past, but you do it in all your artworks.
Yes.
Have a landscape, and well, actually, you're working on some nice piece right now called landscape color fields, from my understanding.
Yes. So, talking about the color field, it arrived in New York. I did a few quick studies in 2016, where I used the same ink that I used to stain the wooden sticks on unprimed canvas. And they were like drawn freehand and some with rulers. And as it happened, actually when we met the first time here in Mexico City during the show at Les Laboratoires at Julian, the show was called Order and Disorder. And what happened is I arrived in Mexico City a little bit early, and then my wife Florencia came later, and she was looking for some papers, and she went through my filing cabinet, and she discovered those landscape color field paintings that I did in 2016 and brought them to Mexico City. And then Julian decided to show them, and they have been sort of like, the response has been really, really good. So I decided to revisit the landscape paintings in 2002, and now I'm working on a larger series. The idea is basically how multiple colors drawn with an eyedropper, and when they mix, for example, like when a blue line intersects a yellow line, that intersection turns green. So it's about the active color mixing within the plane of the canvas.
Yeah, and I think what's fascinating of these works you're doing is that you have a feeling you're observing sometimes. If you go into the micro scale, you have a feeling it's like a pixel often, and if you distance yourself outside, the painting, you start seeing like this grid, and it feels really to me like a cybernetic, color field where, I mean, it's a landscape, but I imagine like conduits, and I imagine like electricity going on through them. But also, I always see what you refer to in the topography, because even a line can have somehow like a mountainous feeling, or if you look back a bit, you're like, well, I think you mentioned once to me that it could be the skyscrapers in New York looked from atop,
Yes.
So, it's a fascinating work.
For me, it was sort of like important that talking about sort of like, how the trajectory of my processes developed over the years. And so a lot of my work deals with lines. And you talked about, the spinning cube before. So while the diagonal axis of the spinning cube creates a moire of different colors and patterns. The large color field paintings now are sort of like done with an eyedropper on the canvas, but since the viscosity of the various colors differs, I also have to sort of like move them at a different speed, and depending on the pigmentation of each different ink, they either run into each other, sort of like they flood each other, or certain lines or certain colors are demarcation lines. So
it stops.
It stops sort of like the
flow
bleeding,
of the liquid.
or like how the water, or like the liquid spaghetti, the surface tension, when a drop falls off the eyedropper, it doesn't dissolve. It doesn't dissolve into the canvas. It maintains its physical structure.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to keep this grid of liquid lines, spaghetti, in harmony, where they can still like interact and mix. And I have about 2 hours time to do that before the ink dries up. So it's a very time-based performance where I have to really focus within sort of like that output.
Yeah, it's always, you feel always this like intensity with time, no?
Yes. But
like the demarcation line for you, it's literally 2 hours because it dries out that way, but it's a way to measure it as well, right?
You can measure, yes. I can tell you when I start a painting, I can tell you what time it is when I'm done within one square of like 40 centimeter. But bringing back sort of like Austria quickly as like a landscape, as a young kid observing how light shifts through the shifting grass, a green is not just green, matcha has tonalities.
Salud, by the way.
Salud. And that's why I'm sort of like also choose matcha as sort of like, it's a ceremonial drink for me, but also like thinking about stuff like, pastures, or like, when the wind flows into a field, how tonalities change. A green is not just a green color. So the matcha is a perfect example of sort of like how you think about color and the shifting palette of colors within one color family.
Well, I'm gonna ask you a different question. It's a more personal one. I want you to be as honest as you can, and
Oh my God! What
the audience. I'm sure they felt this experience, and I felt it too. But I want to know, like, does Alois Kronschlaeger feel existential angst? Do you often say like, wow, fuck, like life is intense, like what's going on? Do you enter a crisis often, or and how you deal with it?
Well, I mean, like, I would sort of like not to sort of like negate your question, but I would split it into two parts of it. One is sort of like me as the artist in the studio, and thinking about the work and the process and what is the next project, and how do you sort of like financially survive within being an independent artist, and then yes, you can have angst of what are the economic difficulties that are now potentially happening within the elections here in Mexico that just happened, or like what's going on in the States or what happened in Austria. So yes, there's obviously a certain unease that can happen, but then privately as a person, I think that yes, you always confronted with a certain sense of how many more years do you have to produce work? Is it still relevant? Is it still relevant within sort of like the situation that you're in now? So
you see it as the time not wasted also, like
I see it in a sense of like I mean, for example, this setting tonight is like almost like a celebration of like being active. And I like being active, and I'm a little bit of a workaholic. So for me, in sense, like I always, I rather, my defense is being offensive in that sense of like thinking ahead of time and moving forward. So it's like I don't want to be growled up and not doing anything. So like being paralyzed by that angst. I feel like that you can be active. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but I would say as an artist, you have to let those vulnerabilities of who you are and sort of like insecurities and come into your studio practice. Actually, I think it's actually very, very good.
Yeah, I guess art, I remember the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer said that to be able to survive suffering, you had to make art, right? Like it's a way to sort of cope with existence, and it's a. He was saying a very sort of dark, prognostic, but like you needed it to live like a plentiful life, and
I mean, I wouldn't, I wouldn't concur that an artist has to suffer to create powerful work.
No, more like you need art to survive suffering.
Yeah, I think all wars are fought to maintain great art. I mean, I would put that spin in there that, in a sense, through our how we record history and human evolution, art has always been a mirror to us.
Yeah.
And I think that's, that will hopefully, be maintained. So that's in a sense where art becomes absolutely reflective of what's happened and what happened in the past.
And perhaps inevitable to humanity, to represent ourselves and mirror ourselves through some means,
Right.
Alois, I know you think we've covered the hardest questions, but we're far from that. I think we should finish our matcha, and I think we're gonna have to jump right into a bit of a harder drink. So this is just some nice beverage that Oaxacan people like to drink. I
think I will like it.
It's the best liquid I've tasted. There you go. Well, cheers, my friend. So, you mentioned your wife, Flor, back a minute ago.
Yeah.
And I want to know, in this romantic sense, what has Flor meant to your life? And did she help you become a better artist? I mean, I think usually someone that comes with us in our creative process has, of course, a big impact in the way that we think, create, love, So give me a bit of that love.
I mean, Florencia is obviously a fantastic person, but besides being a fantastic person, she is an incredible, funny human being.
She is hilarious.
Absolutely hilarious. And I remember when I told her what I do back in 2006 when we met in New York, and I said, I'm an artist. And she said, oh, you an artist? I said, yes. Why didn't you come to the studio? And so I remember she came to the studio with her mom, who happened to visit New York, and I was working on the repercussion series. So we had a talk, and she got a sense of the studio. But to really speed things up, what happened over the last 18 years that we've been together, Florencia being from Buenos Aires and me being from Austria, but we sort of like converged, we met in New York City. Florencia had absolutely an instrumental part in our relationship in my artistic endeavor for example, coming to Mexico. Think about sort of like Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock. We find every important artist that you can think of, there's a partner behind it that makes this picture, that dynamic.
Yeah.
And Florencia absolutely deserves credit how the studio expanded, in a sense of she comes from a theater background. She's performed in numerous plays. She knows how to produce things, within a production value. So we both come from large families, and so for us there was always a lot of people around.
Yeah.
And the studio setting is always we're going somewhere, we're setting up a studio. She has to manage that. So there are endless ways to give her credits that she absolutely deserves to have catapulted that studio practice from New York into this international
Success.
Yes.
Yeah. I agree.
Cheers to
Flor and her hilariousness, I guess, and her talent, of course.
Salud, mi amor, ti amo.
Salud, Florecita. So, all right.
That was an easy question, man.
Okay, but
This one I don't need to
that was
start.
to charm you a little.
That's stuff having a dessert.
Yeah, but you need some ash right now, so let's go into it.
Okay.
So, okay, do you fear death?
Well, for example, I talked to someone in your crew earlier about Japan.
Shout out to the guys.
And the Japanese have a saying, mono no avare jiru, that means, it's like a Hindu saying within Shintoism, after you realize death, old age, and sickness, supposedly there's not really, joyfulness in life. Do I fear death? I mean, I just came back from Austria from a funeral.
Yeah.
So, if you stand on the edge and somebody's getting buried, or the ashes are being, we all know the ritual of death.
Right.
Even within the moments of sorrow, there's a certain beautiful tradition and custom.
There's a ritual, of course.
There's a ritual.
Yeah, involved.
And so the ritual, funerals can be absolutely stunning, no matter how traumatic and painful they can be on an emotional side. Am I afraid of death? I don't really know. I haven't really given it a thought. I think that I'm, people can maybe wish for a beautiful death. I don't know what a beautiful death is, that maybe one day you just fall asleep, or you don't want to suffer. So.
Yeah, depends on the culture, of course.
Yes.
There's a beautiful death, as in
death as a new beginning. I don't know. It's death is not, the word doesn't scare me.
Yeah.
But who knows when we get closer to it.
Right. In anthropology, we say that death is something people never experience. It's something we imagine, or is something that we socialize, but it's not ever something that we actually understand. It's not graspable for us, because in order to understand death, you must die, and you cannot die and be conscious at the same time, right? So in a way, it's this paradox of humanity where we want to understand it and do all these crazy rituals around it. Think of the Egyptians. Or
if I think about death, it's in a sense of thinking about now and how we could enjoy the moment now maybe more,
right,
in a sense of seeing it as a vanishing moment.
Right.
So again, my artistic mind would say be productive, don't procrastinate, because in a sense, time is limiting. So but on the other side, time is endless. So
right. Big paradox.
Yes, and that paradox is also, maybe death is a paradox.
Yeah. Maybe the ultimate paradox.
The ultimate paradox.
Yeah.
To have new ideas, old habits have to die.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a constant being in flux from something that's manifested and then vanishes, and something else comes into your field of vision,
right,
as an idea, as a thought, as a fata morgana, so like as a vision. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I enjoy the ritual around death, I must say. And as Florenza would tell you, that, for example, Austria, there's a lot of, in Austria, you go to the cemetery, as you do in Mexico. So this maybe also brings me closer to Mexico, because there's such a death ritual here that I'm very familiar with in Austria. So.
And is it, what is unique about Mexico to a degree is the way that we celebrate death. So it's not per se a ritual of mourning, but you give the best food to your family, well, the past ones, and you know, you bring nice sweets for them, and colorful flowers, and so that it's somehow a way to connect with our ancestry, but also it's interesting that there's this division in cultures, right? Like Egyptians didn't believe in it in this way, but they actually measured, if you would enter the underworld or not through the feathers of Mat, right? Like these who would welcome you in the underworld, and if you actually found joy in your life or not, you would go in, and have this eternal second life,
Yes.
And some other cultures are going completely against this idea of like that you have to celebrate death. I feel like it's a more Western idea of like, mourning, and there's only the end of it, but of course there's the Abrahamic context of thinking there's an afterlife as well.
But I think also as an artist in the studio, you're confronted with death, sort of like within the process. Right. You have to let go of ideas, or you create something new, like you let things, you edit stuff out. So it's not obviously the physical death of a living thing, but it's a death of a thought, a death of an idea.
Yeah.
And that can also be mourned.
Right, like when you put the last brush stroke in the painting, and you're like, shit, it's finished. You should feel completely satisfied, and then you're like, well, it kind of feels like I'm mourning the work. Or
like you're mourning the time that it's completed.
Okay, so let's jump in to a different question, which is more about these intersections that I find in your work, right? Like I see interconnectedness in your work. I see there's a network, there's a grid, there's a cybernetics, there's this organism somehow that it's, like either alive through us because we are perceiving it, but it kind of feels like it's, emanating some type of halo. But so I have talked to you before about Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher, who seemed to have a great impact on one particular principle that you seem to have acquired from him, and that is the notion of the fold.
Yes.
Could you explain what the fold is a little bit, and perhaps how you use it, afterwards, how you use it with your work, or how did you learn about it? And
the book The Fold by Jules Deleuze was written, I think, in '88, and then it was published in English in '93 or something. And the title Leibniz and the Baroque.
Right.
And how it relates to architecture and sort of like to our sense of who we are, like the sense of information. They sort of like Leibniz called it the nomad, sort of like where it's almost like
the monad.
Yes,
right.
Monad, where something is compressed or folded, and it holds the quintessential energy, or like the part of it. Sort of like where the world and the reality could be somehow crystallized, or sort of like compressed in this idea of of time. And my work, when I did the repercussion series, when I talked about Frank Stella, the Coney Island series that he painted in 1959, I used him and his painting series as a direct reference to the work that I called the repercussion series, a series of divisive events. And I was interested in how sort of like something very strict rectilinear suddenly becomes folded over, physically compressed, and then changes the shape and the awareness of what that thing became. So I looked something like, how even so like within sort of like the Gothic architectural to the very elaborate Baroque or Rococo, how the line shifts. And within my research, I came upon the book, The Fold, and I tried to sort of like use his writing as a reference. How does it relate to my process? What happens to a line that sort of like holds its geometric straightness that suddenly becomes sort of like, curvilinear? There's something that suddenly is compressed.
Right. And it doesn't seem to be as, clear, or it seems to always have, again, like the concept is the fold, and it's always having some strange compression within it, right? Like,
and within time.
Right.
And so, like, the subtitle of the exhibition that was actually my first solo show in New York, Repercussions, a series of divisive events, is sort of like the divisive event is that active manipulation of that line, that's a latex cork line on Fabriano paper, and suddenly the material changes into something else. The rubber line acts like a bungee cord. The paper suddenly has a reflex. There's suddenly energy in there.
Right.
It's sort of like something is
preserved,
loaded. Something is, it's like almost like charged.
Yeah.
And that's for me how I related to his writing.
Right.
That suddenly the paper is not just a paper anymore. The material combination between the paper and the latex, the bungee, within the active sense of the paper from flat 2D rectilinear, the sculpture work suddenly turned curvilinear topographical without doing any edits to the actual shape.
Yeah.
So that became sort of like, for me, a reference of thinking about sort of like, I don't know. That's difficult to explain within sort of like a philosophical act that happens in the studio.
Yeah, it is. But I think you've managed to use this idea or this principle and sort of extrapolate from it like the best possible scenario. And of course, there's an infinite version of your works that could still happen. So I'm sure that there's a lot of creativity in you that will, come up with these new ways to fold matter in some sense, or
but also like the matter is like I've always it's like to explore a little bit further. I always would sort of like say roughly, if you talk about the Homo sapien, you talk about 50, 100,000 years of art making, and you as an artist try to locate yourself within that priori, what happened historically within human evolution. If you include the Neanderthals, then maybe you go back 250,000 years of how they piled or like stacked logs to get a certain sense of how their activities got manifested into an act that might started out as a ritual, a communal act of doing that brings them together. And as an artist, and having, now worked for the last 30 years actively, there's always a sense how you try to have a certain moment where you make another fold, another wrinkle in time.
Right.
Where suddenly your work can also shift within the material sense, but also like how you change as an artist and you adopt a different sense of the self.
Right. You shift.
You shift.
The fold is a shift also, internal, subjectively.
And also it's a different mirrors of how that is being also amplified within a new city. I mean, I think Mexico City, has been a tremendous fold for me.
Right, and in itself, it's a fold within
not
itself.
Not just inward, maybe even an outward fold.
Right. So it's, from what I can understand of the fold, I feel we should also say that when you literally think of things folding onto themselves, we can go so far with this principle. We can think of, how a mountain, a topography itself is sort of shaped but we can also think of genetics as in the double helix sort of folding on itself and carrying this crazy amount of information within us, and we have millions of it, or I don't know how much. Right. It seems like this principle carries a real lesson for humanity. From my perspective,
and for me, thinking about stuff we talked about the color fields before. If you work about within stuff let's say 150 different colors, and you have within a painting of 120 centimeter by 120 centimeter, you have maybe 20,000 cross connectors.
Right.
Just imagine about the multitude of various hues of colors that are being created.
Infinite.
Even when I'm done and I come back the next morning and look at it, and certain colors, veins were still pulsating and affected,
the
pigments and the color shifted 10 shades over. So
right. The curvature of the line, the connection it creates.
I think it always becomes sort of a certain sense of mirroring of oneself within the mindset that we are in that instant adhering to.
What other books have sort of influenced you? You think you mentioned Longitude?
Longitude was super interesting within thinking about how John Harrison, who was this clockmaker, where he had this idea of solving the biggest problem of navigation
at the time.
At the time, within a mechanical instrument. It had a huge impact. Where I read it because it's sort of a science fiction back then, trying to visualize what was going on in the 17th century, but then working on it. And then, you read it and then 10 years later you have, this could be an idea to trying to visualize something within that, within a certain project. Other books, for example, if I think about Murakami, the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, is thinking about stuff like a certain vertical axis that goes down into a cellar or a well, sort of like a certain sense of subconscious terrain that maybe I wouldn't really be happy to go down there, but maybe you would or you need to. So within a lot of artist books or artist biographies, there's always a sense of how do you connect to your own studio practice, and how you can fall in love with a book because it's so totally different than what your work is about, or how you could sort of expand upon that viewpoints of what comes into your field of vision thinking about a certain process.
Yeah, it's crazy how much amount of information is hidden in a book, you know, and the fact that we have so many libraries now linked to it. But I mean, we'll have to keep reading that never-ending list, you know.
Yes.
So, you know, I feel you're a very philosophical person. I love having in-depth discussions with you. You know, we're good friends for a while now, but I really want to know, like, you know, this really broad question. It's like, how do you see the future of our world, and what do you think is humanity's role in the universe?
That's a serious question.
That's a serious question. A bit of a joke as well, you know. It's clearly impossible to answer perfectly, but
I mean, who am I to answer that? I mean, my part, or how I decided to live my life as an artist, creating work, is, I think, pretty independent. Obviously, you know, it can be seen as an active participation within sort of like what the community does. I could imagine that, you know, art and technology will always merge. When the railroad was invented, there were studies that, you know, driving 25 kilometers an hour through the landscape would be bad for your health.
Total BS.
Back then, total BS.
Yeah.
So I think that, you know, I think the future of humanity is you know, being a hybrid creature.
A hybrid creature.
Yes.
Yeah.
Brave new worlds.
Yeah. Up for grasp.
Yes. The universe needs to be explored. I think Earth is maybe a vanishing planet. We colonize different parts of the universe. So I'm optimistic. It's not. I think even if, you know, I mean, global warming is obviously a huge.
It's a shitstorm, man.
It's absolutely crazy. But then I think it's sort of like what the educational system could be totally transformed.
Right. If we could go, instead of making these really complicated questions, we could be saying like,
exactly, what is being taught in schools and how you create better
change
human
the pedagogy?
beings. Exactly. I think the syllabus within the educational institutions maybe need to be rewritten to make us better human beings.
Right.
And it starts out with the youngest generation, the kids. So I believe the future belongs to the kids.
Right.
And we are already in the dying generation.
Yeah.
So that didn't really answer your question, but I think it's like a very direct. You know, you cannot stop technology, and why would you?
Right.
And there will be something that becomes. You know, think about artificial intelligence.
Well, yeah, let's just do it.
Let's just jump right in there.
Why not?
Why not?
So what? I mean, I remember taking a class back in my philosophy, you know, grad studies, and most of the questions we were making about AI were really about how to conceptualize it, because of course when we think of like intelligence, it's a bit overrated, you know. We think, oh, it must be rationality, it must be a similar conscious life to a human being, it must be like great at playing chess, and then, you know, that's never gonna happen. People were saying, you know, at the time in the 60s, I think already, and it just didn't mean ever what we expected it to mean, you know. So it's of course feels like this artificial, you know, concept itself of trying to give it a name of something we're creating. And
for example, you think about, like, you know, Stanley Kubrick, 2001, Space Odyssey.
Right.
You know, when
Hall is it
Hell
not
2000.
Right.
And I think this is, like, you know, beautiful idea that back then, this computer monitors in the film didn't exist, they were painted. But they already had this foresight, what it could mean to have a counterpoint to the human understanding that is artificial, based upon programming and science. So
Right.
I think it has to do with what we could foresee as our counterpoint to the human race, to the human consciousness.
Right. Like a mirror to us as well.
A mirror to the universe. Who are we, and why is the universe expanding, and what does it all derive from? So I think that, again, the idea that there's something besides us that could give us insights,
Yeah.
even if it is programmed by us, but the machine becomes something else, is for me somehow obviously frightening, but also somehow very exciting.
Yeah, it definitely has like a nightmarish vibe as well, because there's no sci-fi film we've done with AI that ends up well.
Yeah,
But maybe that speaks for our own fears and projections and so on. But so I mean, one of the earliest accounts of AI, and I mean, even when computers were starting, you had the Turing test, right?
Right, the Turing test.
By Turing. And from what I remember, the Turing test was something like you have agent A, agent B, agent C. Agent C plays like the role of either A or B, and if A recognizes or thinks C is B, then, it must be conscious. Or if it can appear as being human.
Submerging behavior.
Right. If it
that is not programmed, but somehow becomes a result of multiple individual information that suddenly becomes independently voiced reaction.
But I think even from in the beginning, it was really meant to trick other humans to believe this was conscious, without it being necessarily conscious, right? So it was the supposition that that would mean consciousness, that if it was able to trick us, and of course you had later, I think, IBM's, like psychiatry, it's like psychiatry type of, asking questions and sort of letting someone see the monitor of the computer and sort of answering questions, and then the program was asking questions only. It wasn't actually letting the person know, but it was apparent enough, or it appeared enough, or it camouflaged enough, like our type of conscience that it felt, alike, and that's what was attributed back 4 decades ago. To AI, and now it's completely different. Of course, we have ChatGPT and AlphaGo, and you have all these.
And it's a fantastic research tool if you just type in something quickly.
Right.
Within the information content regarding art and artificial intelligence.
It's pretty
I would
strange,
like to
right?
see what comes out within the future. Even within stuff like design or stuff like architecture, you have different programs you give them certain words and they design your facade.
Right.
So I think or even how they call it a co-pilot program within artificial intelligence that separates stuff like it's not overriding your opinion, but it just offers you a certain, again, self-reflection.
Right.
And if it could be edited more cohesively.
Right. It seems it has become more philosophical, because from what I understand, the questions now are what matters, and maybe previously on the scientific scheme what mattered was that you were able to find a nice formula to solve complex issues, and the simplest formula which could solve the biggest issues, that's the objective. But with AI, it feels like we must, sort of format it in the correct way, and the way that what matters is the formatting now.
Right.
Like what matters is that what question are you asking?
And how often do you ask Chat GTP for your kind of work, for example?
Right.
Is it a daily exercise that suddenly, okay, let me see what's going on, like what are the responses, or do you use it occasionally?
Is it an assistant, right?
Yes.
Or has it a mind of its own? I don't know.
Or do you trust it or not?
We are already in an age where we have like deep fake and fake news and
alternative facts,
and everything seems to be like hyper postmodern, right? Like there's no universal truth at the moment. Everything seems like crystallized and looked through like 1,000 views of a kaleidoscope,
Mm-hmm.
But it's concerning also what can happen with like works of art that are plagiarized because an AI can do it now, like exactly perhaps how an artist would make it, like.
What I read a while ago, but it sort of deals with economics, that for example the British copyright law was so strong that information or like manuscripts, how to do things, were tightly held back, and the events of like in other European countries they were more loose, so information manuals were wider shared, and that led to economic growth because the information was not held back.
Right.
So now I guess with the information being readily available becomes a question mark, is the information that you actually have access to, is it valid or is it correct?
Right.
So,
well, I do agree with this whole open AI sort of system open source, and just not allowing just one group of people to have like this type of technology, but sort of opening it to the public and to a broader audience. Right. So, 2 more questions and we're done.
Yeah.
If you had the chance to live in an epoch and talk to a thinker, scientist, artist, who would that be and why, and like what would you ask that person?
So you're talking about the yellow submarine that travels either back in time or...
I mean, you can imagine whatever transport method you need, so but like if it's a yellow submarine, I'm good for you.
The Beatles, so like the idea of like, well,
can be a time capsule as well without the yellow submarine, but you can choose.
It could be an atomic clock where the time is differently.
Yeah, made of uranium.
Sense of time.
Yeah.
Yes, time is always sort of like very. You could theoretically go back in time.
I think I've heard it's quite complex to make that case, but tell me.
I mean.
It's like the kill your grandfather type of theory, right?
I'm very much a person that is in the now.
Right. Well, if you could.
Yes.
What would you ask?
The theoretical thing, if I could, is to live in a different epoch. It sounds maybe exciting, but it feels sort of like a little bit of a period movie. It might be dress up.
Yeah.
And then if I travel back in that time, would I still be aware of my conscious now of 2024?
Yes. I'll give you that. Yes. Yeah. You have your current memory, and you can just ask a question.
I'm going back, let's say, and I meet Leonardo da Vinci.
Oh, okay. Nice.
And I say, my name is Alois, or call me Don Alonso.
Don Alonso, yes.
I was born in Austria.
Currently in Mexico.
Spent some time in New York, and currently in Mexico. And I was just asked this question by Nicklas.
Yeah, it's a random guy.
And it's a random thing, and so here I have a few questions for you.
Yeah, just one.
My question to him would be most likely his take on time and space. Because
of course, there's no doubt.
It's like a reoccurring thing. The problem, not the problem that I have with your question, but the problem that I have within that scenario is in a sense that it becomes a little bit of an escapism. Either in a period that maybe you wished that is maybe more interesting and more dynamic politically or more...
I mean, you can choose it.
I know. But in a sense...
It's not better or worse.
I don't think it would be, for me, a person... I don't think I would go back in time. I think I would go forward in time. So I would say, if I have this option right now, I would like to have the year, let's say, 1,000 years from now, and maybe talk to a counterpart, whoever that is.
Maybe it's an AI. By then, I'm not sure we will be alive,
I think I would rather go into the future than into the past.
Right, okay.
I think that's like...
So, erase Da Vinci in this scenario.
Da Vinci is absolutely a super interesting person as an artist, as an engineer, as a thinker, as this absolutely,
Brilliant
mega
guy.
important person.
Yeah.
And he's an easy choice for me. There are maybe 100 other people that I could name you, but or maybe you want to talk to Lucy.
Not sure she could talk, but she could make some noises maybe.
Exactly, 200 million years ago.
We're talking about the Homo australopithecus that lived 6 million years ago, basically.
So I think that, again, it becomes a reflection of now, but within time and space. And so currently, I think the past has been explored pretty amazingly through our historical recording and writing and artifacts. So beam me up into the future.
Okay. There's I don't know if you ever saw this film. I mean, I'm sure it's been critiqued, because maybe it hasn't the best quality, but it was called The Time Machine. I mean, it's also a book, right?
Right.
By Jules Verne. Am I not fucking that up? And from what I remember, I mean, these protagonist goes to the future, finds out there's no humans, but there's like bits of that, like humanity, and I think he finds, this protagonist finds a library where there's like an AI integrated in the library that can tell you about what happened with humanity later on. So maybe that would be a great person to ask, in case that's our destiny,
Yes. Or imagine the sequels to Planet of the Apes, and you see.
Love the films. So many people criticize them, man.
Touch of Liberty.
I love the films.
In sand, and you're like, oh yeah, that's so like.
Stop the haters for Planet of the Apes, please. Yes. We all love it. So, okay, final question, and I feel this should be really heartfelt.
Okay.
What would you say to someone starting in the art world? What advice would you give them?
Yes, I mean, this is sort of like a question that I have been asked before. And there's always a moment where you feel like, you obviously, you want to be honest within your advice, but as you know that, every advice you give can be taken with a grain of salt. And the one thing that I would say is that be humble, be honest. In your early days as an artist, in this kind of setting, you can tell fantastic stories and have, anecdotes, and you can sort of like play the game, but never fool yourself if you're honest or if you're dishonest. And I think as an artist, there becomes sort of like sense, never bullshit yourself. And that's, I think, something that is maybe not that easy at times. You have a certain sense of optimism, of a certain sense of you want to do this, you want to. Can be felt sort of, that one is productive, but it's difficult because success is always measured. He or she is producing work and they're very content. It could also be that for them success means they start it out but then they do something else. Been doing this for so many years. It would be very difficult now for me to take a 180 turn and become something else.
Yeah.
So have certain ideas materialize in your medium or whatever that is, if it's painting or sculpture, installation or writing. And then when that is taking shape and you grow, then there becomes a point where the work becomes you and maybe you don't even realize. So there's a certain sense of for me, I'm not, the work that I do in the studio is not work, that's who I am. So suddenly there's a certain sense where your identity shifts. And I think at the early stages, it's good to have a certain construct, maybe call it a certain schedule, a certain ritual, where you slowly morph from the person that becomes that artist.
Yeah.
And it's very important that you have your peers, your friends. A setting like this is always helpful to talk about ideas and share stories and opinions. So, but then you also have samples people that became sort of very they're hermits that don't act or actify in the social setting. So it's a very complex question, but I would say, as I said earlier, within the 777 modular, if you want to be easy on yourself, maybe have an idea to give yourself a certain sense of where you don't undermine yourself constantly, or maybe not be too critical. You have to be critical, but
it's always tough, man.
Give yourself a certain leverage.
Right. Just stay humble, being the president a bit.
Yeah, and
and do your work.
But stay healthy in that sense. Don't become. It's so easy to fall into a sense of, where your sense of reality breaks down. It becomes sort of convoluted with stress, or sort of the sense of you haven't made it yet, and that's sort of take your time. Right. Time is on your side.
Right.
That's what I would say.
Yeah. Seize the day, yeah?
Yes.
Well, I just want to say, to finish up, Alois, thanks for all the work you're doing. I think it's really mesmerizing, everything that you can come up with. I really appreciate your friendship, and just keep it going, man. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Nicklas.
And salud again.
Querido.
Salud.
Si deseas apoyar a Anthropoide 2, puedes encontrar nuestras redes sociales en la descripción. Suscríbete.